So this lecture is going to talk about some of the ways evolution works, some of the mechanisms of evolution. So we are going to talk about the three types of evolution on the left: natural selection, including fitness trade-offs. We're going to talk about genetic drift, including bottlenecks. We're going to talk about gene flow, including the founder effect. What we're not talking about in this lecture are some of the other things, other ways evolution works. The big one that we're not discussing is sexual selection. But there's also genetic recombination during sexual reproduction and the formation of sperm and eggs, or meiosis, as well as human selection. So we'll start with natural selection, also known as survival of the fittest. This is the one that most people have heard about and understand. And in this situation, the fittest individual is the one who survives and gets to reproduce. And they pass on their trait that made them fit to their offspring. So their offspring are a little bit fitter than the others, more likely to survive to adulthood and reproduce, and pass on that trait to their offspring, and so on and so forth. When we say fittest, we mean best adapted to where they live, to their local ecosystem. A cheetah is a very fast runner. You put them in dense forests like you find in New England, they're not going to be able to catch the deer. They're faster than the deer, but they don't corner very well. They go in a straight line very well, and trees would be a problem. When we think about fitness, sometimes there are biological trade-offs. So the cheetah can run very, very, very fast. They're very specialized for sprinting, but they can't go very far. So if they don't catch their prey in a relatively short time period, forget it. They're not going to be able to keep chasing them. Humans, on the other hand, we're really good at longer distances compared to a lot of animals. So we can walk, or some of us can run relatively long distances and for a relatively long time, but we're really slow compared to most animals. What other fitness trade-offs can we think about? Well, some animals produce lots and lots of offspring. If you do produce lots of offspring, most of your offspring are not going to survive to adulthood. Because if you have a lot of offspring, you can't put as many resources in each individual offspring. If you put lots of resources into each offspring like humans do, you can't have as many kids. So these are fitness trade-offs. Genetic drift. Now, natural selection is based on fitness. Genetic drift doesn't care about how fit you are or how well adapted to your current environment. This is more common in small populations, and it can result in the loss of certain alleles. And an allele is a version of a gene, so you're losing genetic diversity. When we talk about genetic drift, we are talking about, as an example, bottlenecks. So, what is a bottleneck? Well, This is a situation where a specific population or species undergoes a relatively sudden and really big decline in population size. This can be caused by diseases, natural catastrophes, human-caused catastrophes, until you've only got a relatively few individuals left. These individuals have less genetic diversity than the original population. And that causes a loss of the genetic diversity, and the alleles, the versions of the genes that survive, are going to end up being more common in that population when the population rebounds or grows larger again. There is a great example in humans. There's a place called Pingalap Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, and in 1775 there was a major typhoon. Typhoon is basically a hurricane. And this hurricane killed off all but 20 individuals. One of these individuals had what we call a loss of function allele, a version of a gene that was mutated so that it did not work. And this loss of function produced near total color blindness, a condition called achromatopsia. A, of course, means without. Chroma refers to color. Opsia refers to the eye. So, without color vision. This allele worldwide is pretty rare, significantly less than 1% of the population. But today, on Pingalap Atoll, over 10% of the population has this form of color blindness. And because it is what we call a loss of function allele, that means it's recessive. So that means 10% of the population have 2 copies of this very, very rare allele. These individuals are very light sensitive and unable to perceive most colors. Nearly a third of the population are carriers that have 1 copy of this allele. So that is not an example of selecting for fitness, because having achromatopsia produces an individual who's less fit, but it is genetic drift. Gene flow is another non-fitness related way evolution works. Founder effect, again, we're talking about a small population size, and one individual or a small group of related individuals, like a bunch of family members, move into an established population. They bring their own unique genetic alleles with them, alleles that were not in the population beforehand. So this is changing the allele frequency, how common these less common alleles are in this population, unless regular migration occurs. So they bring in these new alleles, these new versions of the gene. Those new versions of the gene become more common in that population as long as that population is isolated from regular migration. So you've got a small population, and because it's a small population, there has to be some level of what's called inbreeding. If you live in a community of 1,000 people, eventually you're going to be related to everybody. You've got a small gene pool, so you don't have a lot of genetic diversity to begin with. A form of founder effect that works on a bigger scale is colonization. When you get a small population, or more accurately, a pretty big population moving into a new area, changes the genetics up in that area. Okay, so let me give you an example. This woman named Maria Soto moved to the Lake Maracaibo region in Venezuela in the 19th century. And she had an allele for Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a neurological disorder. It usually affects older individuals past their peak reproductive year, and it occurs in about, this is a small number, 0.007% of the population. It usually shows up in the 40s. It is fatal, and it is what we call a dominant mutation. So if a person has one copy of the Huntington allele, they will have Huntington's disease. If they have Huntington's disease, their children will each have a 50% chance of also developing Huntington's disease. In Lake Maracaibo, there is a high rate of an early onset form of this disease. It's occurring in over 1% of the population, and it can show up as early as age 2. Wow. So Maria Soto brought this allele into the area in the 19th century, and now all of the individuals in this community that have Huntington's disease can trace their ancestry to her. And there are around 18,000 people in this community that can trace their ancestry to her. This population was really important for identifying the gene involved in Huntington's disease, which allows researchers to try and figure out what's going on, or for individuals who know it runs in their family to find out if they're going to have it, or possibly do some pre-pregnancy screening to see how likely it is their offspring will inherit it, and so on and so forth. Now, this isn't biology, but the Lake Maracaibo region of Venezuela is the lightning capital of the world. And if you want to take lightning pictures, this is the place to go because they have more lightning than anywhere else. Just don't get Huntington's disease. Well, it's not contagious. So forget that part. Okay. So those are natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow.